right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Extending Empathy Project. This evening, we'll feature Dr. Diane Zosky, Interim Dean of College of Arts and Sciences here at Illinois State University. She'll be presenting on outcomes and process, extending empathy with perpetrators of intimate partner violence. I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I'll be providing technical direction tonight to assist anyone who needs assistance, as well as moderating any comments that do occur during the talk. We ask that those of you who are participating via Zoom, if you have questions or comments or discussion items, that you post them in the chat, and we will immediately get to those conversation items as soon as Dr. Zosky's talk is completed. And those of you joining us on YouTube tonight, welcome. Feel free to post your comments on the YouTube channel, and we will get to those as soon as we can. Please know that there is about a 10 to 20 second delay, and that your comments may not be received in real time, but we will get to them as soon as possible. So with that, I turn it over to my colleagues to present the Extending Empathy Project.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. And as he said, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan. On behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Psychology here at Illinois State University, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this evening's installment of the Extending Empathy Project on the road to Tulsa. This project actually started in the fall of 2018 when I sent out a call to department faculty and graduate students, inviting them to participate in a project that would allow us to project a more empathetic voice into our university environment and the community at large. As you can see, during that first year, we sponsored 10 talks by both faculty and graduate students. Last year, due to the pandemic, we were only able to schedule 4. And then in June of last summer, we decided to schedule a final talk for the year that was given by Drs. Byron Craig and Dr. Stephen Rocco regarding what should empathy be in this moment of historical reckoning, reconciling Black trauma, whiteness, and the historical structures of racism since 1619. As soon as this talk can be given, we knew it had been a smashing success, and we knew that we need to continue the series and title it The Extending Empathy Project on the Road to Tulsa. So this new series began this year with a talk given by myself, in which I addressed whether or not we might consider extending our empathy into the actual structure of our infrastructure, followed by a talk by Dr. Leandra Paris, in which she talked about the difficulties of therapy with clients experiencing trauma. Then Dr. Vanessa Hintz gave us an amazing talk of the role of empathy in healing the culture divide. Drs. Eric Wisselman and Ms. Anna George gave an amazing talk on reducing the moral empathy gap within political conversations. And on our last talk, Dr. Dan Lannon taught us how to exercise empathy by strengthening our ability to empathize effectively. Recordings of these amazing talks can be found on the YouTube links in the flyer that's in the chat. And the series picks up tonight with our next colloquium, and we'll end with the final on June 1st to be given by Drs. Craig and Racco. It's our hope that over the course of this series, we can collectively come to understand an approach to empathy that does not shy away from the hard, important choices we need to make in this country about wealth, inequity, and opportunity, and their relationship to diversity, inclusion, and justice. We hope you will attend all of our remaining colloquia, join the conversation, spread the word, and help us extend a grounded, resources-informed approach to empathy to a larger and larger audience. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague and fellow collaborator on this project, Director of the School of Communication, Dr. Stephen Hunt.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. And the series really has been amazing. It's been an amazing series, and all the talks have been outstanding. The School of Communication is proud to co-sponsor the Extending Empathy Project with the Department of Psychology. And there are a few people that I would like to thank specifically. Dr. Carpenter, who you met earlier, has been amazing. He's the school's director of convergent media, but he's handled all things related to technology in the series and done just an outstanding job of it. To Dr. Byron Craig and to Dr. Scott Jordan, we are exploring options to expand this initiative to all of the universities affiliated with the National American Democracy Project next year, and we look forward to that work. To our Dean, Diane Zosky, who has been an incredible supporter of this initiative and so thrilled to have her talking again with us this evening. And to Felice Noodleman, who's the Executive Director of the National American Democracy Project. Thank you, Felice, for spreading the word about this work. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Craig. And we have kind of among us a little running joke that all roads lead to Dr. Craig. So Dr. Craig, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hunt. So I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing Dean Zosky this evening. So Dr. Zosky is currently serving as the interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She is a professor in the School of Social Work and was the director of the school from 2010 to 2018. Dr. Zosky is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified partner abuse intervention professional in the state of Illinois. Her area of practice and research is with survivors and perpetrators of intimate partner violence. She has an MSW degree from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in clinical social work from Loyola University, Chicago. She is most proud of being a Redbird alumni with her BSW degree from Illinois State University. So without further ado, let's welcome Dean Zosky. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron. And I need to echo what Steve said a bit ago, and my thanks go out to Steve and Scott and Byron for organizing this whole series now for another year, a second year in a row. And it's really has been a wonderful experience. I also want to thank each of you for being here tonight. You know, it is a lovely spring night outside, and there are many other things that you could do with your time rather than be here. So thank you for this. As we go through the talk tonight, it might be a little different than some of the other talks. It might have a little bit more parallel with Leander Paris's talk in terms of trauma. Many of the talks were perhaps more an exposition of research in some of our scholars' life's work in terms of the empirical research. There'll be a little bit in this, but this is going to be a little bit more, I'm going to say maybe a clinical journey with me in terms of another area of my life. So I'm going to share this screen here for just a bit. There you go. I think you're seeing that. Am I right, Nate? Good. Okay. So as Byron and Steve and Scott has introduced the title Empathy with IPV is obviously the acronym for Intimate Partner Violence Perpetrators, and looking at both empathy as an outcome, but a process. But, you know, really, okay, that's a lot of words, you know, really, we could have titled this talk really hurt people, hurt people. Hurt as both an adjective, but also as a verb. And I think that's, I'm reminded, as I did this work in intimate partner violence, I was reminded of this a lot. And I had to anchor to this a lot in terms of doing the work. I'll kind of walk you through that journey a little bit. So where I want to go tonight, and we're not going to use a lot of slides. I'd rather have this be more, you know, conversational. We can talk amongst ourselves. But I just want to explain, you know, my third act. I spent half of my professional life as a social worker out in the field. I was a late bloomer. I often say I was a late bloomer. I didn't come back to the academy and get my PhD until I was in my late 30s, early 40s. And so I was a practicing social worker for much of my life, and that was rewarding. And much of that practice was in the area of intimate partner violence, but much more on the side of working with survivors of intimate partner violence. And then I got my PhD and came into the university and became an academic. But then, particularly with social work, there's really a draw for me, and it's actually an asset in the classroom and in my research, to still be connected with the clinical part of my passion in my life. So my third act was sort of balancing both of those and going back into the clinical field and working part-time while I was also faculty and chair in the School of Social Work. But I surprised myself when I entered the third act, because much of my work up to this point had been with survivors of domestic violence. Now, indeed, I took a little bit of a detour when I was working on my PhD, because a lot of my research, my dissertation really focused on perpetrators. Okay? And then when I wanted to go back into the field, I just was compelled to think, I want to get closer to solution. Working with survivors was very rewarding, but it's always after the fact. And it's very rewarding in terms of helping. Let me say, I'm often going to speak in gendered terms here, okay? Intimate partner violence and perpetration and victimhood can be on both sides of gender and all genders. But for the large extent, statistically, it is more often male violence on female. So I will lapse into gender language, but there's a reason for that. So working with survivors is very rewarding. But I thought, rather than, sort of give people fishes, I'd much rather sort of teach them to fish, right? I'd much rather work more proximally to where the problem originates, and that's with perpetrators. Now, when I made that decision in my life, it was a surprise to me, but it was also a surprise to most of the people in my life, because I would probably be known by most of the people in my life as a pretty definite feminist, I guess I would say. And so there was a lot of surprise. You sure, Diane? You sure you want to work with perpetrators? You're going to be able to do this, right? So I want to take a walk through how I was able to do this. And the next two areas I want to talk a little bit about is the theoretical foundation and context for my journey. But then I want to paint a picture of the context of working in PAPE. And PAPE is the acronym of Partner Abuse Intervention Programs. In Illinois, anybody working in a PAPE program has to be certified, programs have to be certified, et cetera. So the acronym is PAPE. So let me talk a little bit about that, and then we'll come back to some screens in a bit. So let me talk about my theoretical journey. I don't know if you care about this or not, but it really, it really sings to me. So when I started out working with survivors, and some of you that are psychologists here, this will maybe sing to you as well. But the theoretical perspective of working with survivors is decidedly firmly in the camp of feminist macro theory, and would identify and define intimate partner violence very much from a high level socio-political frame, from a frame that the reason we have intimate partner violence is because of patriarchy. That people are socialized, men are socialized into patriarchy in our society. And then violence occurs as a mechanism, it's an outcome of the mechanism of power and control to maintain privilege and patriarchy. And so now this is the milieu that I'm working in, this is how domestic violence is defined and understood. Well then, Byron mentioned that I got my MSW from that other school to the east of us. And that program was very much ensconced in more of a family systems perspective. So I'm going to go from macro socio-political to one level down to more what we would call meso or interpersonal in a family structure. And that kind of opened my eyes to the interpersonal dynamics that happen in families, including families where there's intimate partner violence, and thinking about systems of circular causality and reciprocity and maintaining homeostatic balance. And I want to be very clear that when you look at intimate partner violence in a family and from a family systems perspective, it never shifts the blame of violence to the victim or the survivor. But at least that lens was, I think, a valuable lens for me to see how it happened in terms of the interpersonal dynamics. That it obviously takes two people for the violence to occur. Okay, so then by the time I went to work in working with PAPE, I had already exited my PhD program, and that was at Loyola, which is a clinical program. It's also a bit of an odd duck because it's heavily a psychoanalytic program, which is a little bit rare these days. But that now brought me down from the socio-political of macro down to the interpersonal of a meso, now down to a very proximal micro understanding of how people work. And the psychoanalytic perspective that I enjoyed at Loyola was probably founded more in self-psychology, operations, attachment theory, if that means anything to anyone. But it helps us understand humans by looking at our earliest periods of development, primarily birth to 3 years old. And those are critical foundational developmental years, pretty indelible years that then become, our adult functioning is all a recapitulation from our earliest developmental years. And they also form significant enduring templates for how we see relationships. So, and I'm going to try not to bore anybody with things that really get me jazzed, okay? But if I can bring it down to maybe a very simplified way, I'm going to guess that there are many of you here tonight have maybe born children or are parenting children. We've all been children, but I'm going to guess many of you have experienced the part of being a caregiver, a parent to children, right? And so children at the most basic level, we all as human need 2 things in those earliest developmental years. We need unconditional love from our caregivers, and we need an environment of consistency and stability. And then those 2 foundation blocks become our foundation building blocks for our personality and our structuralization. So caregivers who can unconditionally love us. As babies, we're sponges, nothing bounces off of us. Everything is internalized. Everything is internalized and taken in. And those experiences that are taken in before we have any memory are the building blocks of building who we become. So if I'm taking in a lot of I am loved, I am valued, I am precious, what I'm building is my sense of a self. My sense of self is that I am loved, valuable, and precious. Is a little personal story. Some of you here know I have 2 lovely women daughters. And Michelle, my oldest, when she was about 2 years old, and if some of you remember this when your kids were about, well, a little than that, maybe between 2 and 3, about 3 or so, and you get them out of the tub and they like to streak through the house naked, right? Because it's so freeing, right? And I remember this one scene, and I was in my doctoral program then. So it was all coming together, theory and experience and printing experiences were coming together for me. But Michelle streaks through the house, she sees a full-length mirror and she comes back and she says, oh, I'm beautiful. And then she takes off, right? And I'm thinking at 3, how does you're not hardwired to know you're beautiful. How do you know you're beautiful? And what I saw in my midst is a product of internalization of self-representations of I'm beautiful, right? So that's one piece of it. The other piece of the environment of consistency and safety and stability, that is taken in as a foundation for what I can expect of the other. So we call that object representations or the other representations. So that's my enduring building block. So if some of you are familiar with the kind of seminal developmental theorist Erik Erikson, first stage of development is trust versus mistrust. So if I come out of these first 3 years, and this has been done well enough, doesn't have to be perfect, but well enough, I can go up into my growing years and eventually up into my adulthood with a confident and competent sense of self-identity, and also a sense of trust in being able to be in relationship with other people. And if I can, this is a building block. So if I can trust, I can be vulnerable. If I can be vulnerable, I can be intimate. Okay. So I kind of, laid it out in terms of what ideally, how it has worked for all of us in this room tonight. All of us are well-adjusted, healthy people, right? Well, not so for some people. And so when people come up from those earliest developmental years, and that is either ruptured or not adequate, we often talk about attachment disruptions, and that plays out into, with certain characteristics of people. And essentially, we're talking about people who have pretty fragile egos, have a high need to use defense mechanisms to guard that fragility, that internalized fragility. Some of you will notice I'm in the office with our electronic lights. I have to flap my wings once in a while. So this was my theoretical journey, moving from more of a kind of a patriarchal privilege explains it all to, no, I think there's some things that are kind of internal in our makeup and our identity, right? Okay, now that was my theoretical journey. I want to talk a little bit about the context of working in PAPE, if I can for a minute. Okay. Now, the work in PAPE, okay, first of all, our certified programs in a way were an extension or an arm of the criminal justice system, because the vast majority of people that are mandated to treatment, or we don't really call it treatment, we call it's a group modality, to services are either on probation or they're mandated there by DCFS in terms of an open child abuse case. So by the very nature, it almost is cast in a context of retributive justice versus restorative justice. The field of domestic violence is still pretty heavily ensconced in feminist theory. So coming from that theory of it's all about patriarchy and male privilege, and then we use, there's a lot of cognitive behavioral techniques used. Intervention is always in a group modality, never individually, and that's sort of similar to any sort of a recovery model, that it's done much better in a community. The intervention is more psychoeducational, not particularly clinical or therapy. It's really more psychoeducational. It's very highly curriculum based. The primary goal of these programs are cessation of power and control, based on patriarchy. Because if you can have a cessation of power and control, you're not going to have violence. But a more proximal goal is changing perpetrators' beliefs and increasing their accountability. So it's all based, it's not based on psychoanalytic. It's not based on, I came out of my first 3 years with some pretty serious damage. It's really much more basic cognitive changes in terms of different beliefs, so you'll do different behaviors, okay? Now, here's the thing. The context of working in PAPE, because of the deep-rootedness in feminist theory, is a highly confrontive, highly directive methods. It's also because it's rooted in the criminal justice system, right? Okay, so let's park that for a minute, okay, the context. Now keep in mind here that I'm a facilitator in these group programs, okay? And it's my job to help decrease violence in our communities. And it's my job to invite these people that come, who are mandated to come by the court, to change. And they're perhaps harboring a lot of past injuries and a lot of patriarchal beliefs, right? And then how do they present to us? So let me talk a little bit about most of the people that I would work with. And we would have like 12 to 15 people in a group, and men. We always ran gender-specific groups. I also was involved in some female perpetrator groups, but primarily they're for men, right? Again, statistically, that's the way it turns out. So let me take you for a walk on what a challenge this was, okay? So first night, the groups are 26-week long, right? So first night, all these guys come in, and we see a high preponderance of use of defense mechanisms, right? And that's not surprising in men who are perpetrators. A lot of minimization of the violence, rationalization of the violence, projection, it was her fault, denial that it even happened, shifting the blame to other sources, oftentimes shifting the blame to their victim. I want to make another comment here, okay? I said I started out working with survivors. And when I worked on that side of this dynamic, we use the term survivor. When we're working with perpetrator, we very intentionally use the word victim. And we're going to see how this ties into empathy in a bit, but we very intentionally use that word to not be co-opted into the minimization and rationalization in a sense. Perpetrators often underreport. They use a lot of euphemisms to describe what happened. I can think about one gentleman that I worked with. His account of what happened is I slapped her in the face. Now, when we're in the group room, we have the police record with us, and the actual police and medical record was she was in intensive care, had to have extensive surgery because of orbital fractures in her nose. She had to have extensive plastic surgery to rearrange her nose because it was so deviated. Okay, so you get the point. I slapped her was what we heard. So a lot of minimization, a lot of justification. So a lot of defense mechanisms, right? Another characteristics of how they come in and present is very much socialized in patriarchal beliefs, and men who are perpetrators often subscribe to very rigid gender roles of men being certainly the head of the household and the financial provider, and women being in very devalued positions of caretaker and nurturer and very devalued. Men who are perpetrators are more likely to socialize only with men, not have female friends. And men who are perpetrators are more likely to socialize with men who also engage in intimate partner violence. So there's not only the socialization into patriarchal beliefs, but there's this reification of it in this reinforcement of it in a sense. So that's coming into the room. Another characteristic of perpetrators is inability to trust. I talked about that in terms of the early developmental ruptures. This kind of plays out in terms of attachment disruptions. Vast majority of perpetrators have either witnessed domestic violence in their childhood or were victims of child abuse in their childhood. Donald Dutton has done an extensive amount of research in working with perpetrators, and he identified that 81% of men had cold and rejecting parents, so really had some of those early disruptions in terms of that unconditional love not being met. And literally 26% of the variance in multiple aggression could really be accounted by trauma scores. So we see that, again, this is what's coming into the room for me to work with. Men who perpetrate violence are much more likely to have fragile sense of self and self-esteem. It's a little bit of a conundrum because they will present with a great deal of grandiosity, will present with a great deal of swagger and bravado and a great deal of grandiosity and narcissism. But why would anyone carry around and project out narcissism and grandiosity unless it is a defense and a cover to an impoverished sense of self? So high rates of a very fragile self-esteem and diminished self-esteem. Also coming into this room is a diminished capacity for empathy, what we're going to talk about tonight. So when you think about those early developmental years, and because of this impoverishment and the internalizations that have happened, it's either not been adequate positive internalizations or at worst, negative internalizations. So internalizing, if a child hears over and over and over again, get your ugly mug out of here, which I heard from one family, you were a mistake, we don't want you. And that is coming out in both word and action, more importantly. That's what gets taken in. So that becomes the kernel of the identity of who this person is. So there's these unmet needs that go up into adulthood, this unmet need of unconditional love that I keep looking for love in all the wrong places and in all the wrong ways, in a sense, right? So when this happens, these adults, chronological adults, but yet still very early primitive children in terms of their development, go into adult relationships looking for that unconditional love. So there's this aspect of boundary diffusion between them and their partner. And there's this need gratifying expectation of their partner, that their partner in a sense becomes their auxiliary ego. And that, to defend against my internalized sense of shame and badness, I need you to be my auxiliary ego, to always shore me up and always gratify my unconditional need, my needs that have not been met. Now that's a tall order, that's an impossible order. That will never happen. So when the partner, the female partner fails at that, it's not just you didn't meet my needs, it's you didn't meet my core primitive needs. And so out from that often comes shame-based rage. So this is coming into the room for me to work with. Oftentimes we see this intense need to protect and hide that internalized sense of shame. I am bad. We call that a narcissistic shame is what we call that. So hiding that, it's coming into the room, it's there, but also because they've been mandated to come there to a program that is staffed by a bunch of man-haters, women, me, man-haters. They come in, that's their term, right? They come in expecting a shame evocative process. So there's all kinds of walls and protection going on with that. And then, some of you here might be familiar with Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change theory, and we think about the 5 stages of change. And so almost to a person, many of the people coming into this program are at that first stage of change, which is pre-contemplation, which means I ain't got a problem. And the problem is that I'm required to go here and do this, and let's just get it over with. And so I can get on with my life. So this is my customer that I'm going to work with. And then you throw on top of this the context that we're working, and it's always in a group modality. So I've got to also work against, it's me and a co-facilitator. We work in 2-people teams, and they're most often a male-female team. And we do that to model egalitarian roles, working roles. But we've got to work with this in a group modality where there's these patriarchal beliefs in this room, and there's a lot of reinforcement across in the group dynamic. And we've got to work with about 12 to 15 people that are scared to death of the risk of exposure and vulnerability in front of themselves or in front of other men. Okay, so this is the journey I've taken you on about the work that I came to love, absolutely came to love. I want to share another slide if I can for a bit. Okay. When I came to this, I came to this now, this work, and I've done my own development, my own theoretical growth, and my own educational development. And now I'm here working with these perpetrators in a heavily feministic environment that is part of the retributive criminal justice system. And I'm beginning to experience some dissonance here, because I'm experiencing theoretical dissonance because my perspective now, how I understand, I often say God don't make junk, right? So my father is a man, my 2 brothers are men, the father of my 2 daughters is a man. They have never been abusers, and if we subscribe to the feminist theoretical perspective of violence occurs because of the socialization of men into patriarchal privilege, I'm lost with that, right? But what makes more sense to me is God don't make junk, but sometimes in the first 3 years of life, junk happens, right? And so I'm experiencing this theoretical dissonance of the system I'm working in. I'm experiencing a lot of practice dissonance and values and ethics dissonance because I'm working in a system that is highly confrontive and directive in their methods. Let me also say that when I would work in teams of people, most of the people I worked with also had their day jobs in the criminal justice system. My partner that I worked the most with was a correctional officer in a state correction facility. So comes very much from a hierarchical perspective and a criminal justice perspective, right? But I'm a social worker, and my values and my code of ethics say, no matter what the client or perpetrator did, they're worthy of dignity as a human being. They're worthy of respect just as a human being, not condoning anything they did, okay? So I'm experiencing all this dissonance because I'm working in a practice setting that has really directive methods. I mean, I worked with people that their idea was to literally pound, figuratively, these men in our program into submission, and it wasn't working for me. That's not what I believe, and it's not consistent with my clinical practice orientation. So what became really abundantly clear to me that was missing for me is a whole understanding of empathy. Certainly as an outcome, it became abundantly clear to me what we had to do with these 12 to 15 guys in front of me. We had to help them change their beliefs so that they could change their behaviors and give up power and control. Yeah, we had to do all that, but there was some preceding work we had to do. And in my way of seeing this, we had to work on empathy. We had to help them understand and learn how to engage empathy. I think we're all my opinion is we're all hardwired with the capacity, the human capacity for empathy, but it's one of those things that is caught in life, because as we're exposed to it, we can develop it, right? I'm going to go out of the screen here so I can see y'all. Later in life, it wasn't caught for them. Later in life, now we have the challenge. I think we have the challenge to help teach them how to engage empathy for their partners. If they can engage empathy for their partners, I'm not going to hear, I slapped her, when I really rearranged her nose to the side of her face, right? So this was my challenge. This is why I loved it so much. I started out in week 1 with 12 to 15 people that were just hard as rocks, right? And by the time of 26 weeks was ending, you know, I'm not saying we're all singing Kumbaya and everything, but there was definitely, in fact, I have research that's been published that shows a significant improvement in their ability for empathy from week 1 to week 26 when they ended. It's something I have published in Partner Abuse. So how do we do this now? Okay, now let me also say, and I smile. I hope you can see how much I love this work. It was a labor of love for me. It was a real challenge, but it was so rewarding when I saw success. And it wasn't just the success with the individual men. I'm a social worker. We work with people, but we also work with systems. We consider ourselves to be change agents with people, but also change agents with systems. And I took on, which was even more rewarding for me, is I began to take on the system. And I began to work, I began to build credibility because I'm an educator. I began to be invited to workshops and trainings. And then pretty soon I was president of the Illinois Center for the Domestic Violence Professional Organization, and then doing statewide trainings for DHS, helping the system understand, you people, we have to start at a lower level of our interventions with perpetrators, and that's helped them be comfortable with empathy. Now, let me say, I just said that they're coming into this room afraid to death of exposure, right? And if we're going to take them down a journey of being empathic to what they did to their partners, it's got to be an environment of safety. We have to recapitulate an environment of trust here that we can talk about this, never condoning what they did, but at least not reigniting a shame evocative process for what they did, letting them explore it with us in this room in safety, I guess I would say it that way. So let me go back to sharing a screen here again, if I can. Okay. So I want to talk about 4 concepts here. Got 3 bullets, but there's actually 4 concepts here. Empathy, obviously, that's why we're all here tonight. Accountability, I mentioned that's the second proximal goal of intervention with perpetrators. The first goal, obviously, is cessation of violence, but that means cessation of power and control. Second proximal goal is accountability, being accountable for what they did, because they can't end it unless they, are accountable for it. Said empathy, but there's kind of this mediating step in here that is guilt versus shame. I want to talk about this for a minute, and I keep wanting to come back to. I want you to think in parallel tracks here. I want you to think about outcome, what we're trying to reveal in our perpetrators. An outcome for them is that they can engage and touch into empathy, but also a process of how we do this, never condoning what they did. Okay, so power and control, exercise another down at the bottom here. And what we're trying to get to is that very top, nonviolence, but we're also trying to, the middle step of accountability, of them accepting what they did so they can change it, And then I'm realizing, right, that there's a preceding step here that the system I'm working in hasn't thought about. So somehow we have to work with helping them see what it is like to be a victim, right? And then there's another mediating step in here that we have to stop off at a minute, and that is healthy guilt, okay? Guilt is gonna, if I step into empathy and I really see what I did as a perpetrator, I will probably have a response of a feeling of guilt for that. Now, I said guilt versus shame a bit ago on a screen ago. And of course, the difference, guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And for many of these men, they're into their adulthood, coming into this program the great deal of internalized shame, right? And so we have to be wary of that. Is so it's a trip trigger for them. It's so easy to go down that road. So this sense of path of guilt is it's an externalized event. It's not that I'm bad, I did something bad, but it's an externalized event. It's not coming from an internalized sense of my own badness, right? So in Karen Horney terms, some of you psychologists know of Karen Horney, it's more of guilt is move towards the feeling. Shame is move against or move away from that feeling, right? Shame has to be hidden. It has to be defended against, particularly for many of these guys who are deeply wounded. That to experience shame is literally an experience of self-annihilation. So we have to defend against that. It's a very primitive level, I guess I would say. So what happens if we don't use empathy to help them touch into empathy so they can have a healthy, very appropriate feeling of guilt? What happens if you know, we take them down this path of empathy, of looking at what you did, but we don't help guide this to a response of guilt? And we can do this. We can help guide this discussion, but it steers them down a path of guilt, what you did, not what you are. But what if that doesn't go well? We don't handle it well. And instead, there's a bunch of shame, right? And so what if my methods are very highly confrontive, very direct, very shame evocative about what you did and how bad you are, and shame, literally shame on you. And so if I take them down that path, I'm not going to get accountability, and I'm not going to get nonviolence. I'm going to get a whole bunch of defenses erected and activated against the wall. These walls are going to go up, right? And so if the walls are up and the defenses are all activated to protect the internalized fragility, there's not a lot coming in then. You know, it's all in fight or flight survival mode at that point. So there's not a lot coming in terms of me being accountable and wanting to change my behavior. I'm going to continue the violence. In fact, what we know about this treatment is if the methods are shame evocative, we actually send them out and send them home in a highly agitated state, in a worse state, where they're going to go home, and we might actually accelerate violence when they get home because they're dealing with all of this just intrusion and infusion of shame. I feel bad. What do I do when I feel bad? Well, I reach to my auxiliary ego to make me feel better. And maybe one real quick way I can do this is put her down and perhaps be violent. My internalized rage comes out on her, and all of a sudden I can feel powerful again. So we know that if we choose the wrong path, we can actually make things worse, right? Okay, so keep an eye on our time here. So in this process, you know, there's this dialectic positional balance in partner relationships. We all have them if you're partnered, right? The people that I work with, the guys I work with, they're coming from this dialectic positional balance of power and control, one up, one down, right? We want to move them to the other side of this continuum. We want to move them to seeing relationships as balanced and balance of equality, right? Now, we're going to have to get over that big hurdle of trust, fear of vulnerability, and fear of intimacy, but we want to try to move them to this side of the continuum of equality, right? Well, you know what? In this session here, in the work I'm doing, there's this parallel process of this dialectical balance and position between the counselor, the facilitator, and the client, the perpetrators in the room. I just have talked a little bit about the methods of this system that I worked in was a highly retributive perspective, a highly confrontive, directive methods. It dawned on me, what we're doing with our perpetrators is we're engaging with them from a position of power and control. Now, not denying that I am, in a sense, an arm of the court, because they're mandated to be in this treatment as a condition of probation, and I have to report back to probation monthly. So unabashedly, there is a hierarchical relationship, but do I double down on that in my methods? Or do I try to approach them from my code of ethics of a social worker of dignity, right? And move away from power and control? And do I try to move over as much as possible to a stance of self-determination? Those of us in the clinical perspective, we would all agree that change that emanates out of self-determined change is going to be change that sticks. It's going to be change that works. It's change, right? It's the whole idea of the Prochaska and De Clementi stages of change, whether we're invested in it or not. So I began to have to reconcile in my work and help to influence the other people. Oh man, you guys, I had too many experiences where my co-facilitator got in an argument and got in the face of one of our clients, like, whoa, 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 what are we doing here? You are just enacting power and control when we're telling them not to do that, right? I had one of my co-facilitators that followed the guy out to the parking lot. I was like, what are we doing here, right? So getting certainly me and the people I work with reconcile that it is just fine. We're not going to lose any position here if we decide that this really truly is self-determination and their change. They're mandated to come here, but we can't make them change. They're mandated to come here and they might spend 26 weeks and go out and blow us off. We can't make them change. It has to be their change. So back off the power and control, right? Sorry. So then it occurred to me that what we're doing here, this delicate tension and delicate balance between, I'm trying to invite these guys to empathy. I'm trying to invite them to have an empathic connection to their partner and perhaps to what they've done to their partner. But I am an arm of the court. I have a responsibility. So I do have this responsibility to accountability. I can't stay up in just the warm and fuzzy empathic mirroring of them in terms of how hard it is for them and how they can't help it that they're this way. I have to be rooted also in accountability. That's my job. I don't want them to go home and be violent, right? So I've got to balance this tension between these two fields. And then I've got to balance, I, as the facilitator, have to balance this tension between, I do have hierarchical power over their fate, but knowing that self-determination and change is better, real change, that's where I'm at. Okay. The guys are in the same crosshairs here. As we want them to engage in more empathy, they also have to hold themselves accountable. They can't just stay stuck in, I'm sorry, I did that. They have to be accountable, and they have to move themselves into committing to this change. And then I began to realize I got to walk this delicately. I got landmines all around me here, right? Because in my intervention with them, if I'm too much the social worker and I'm too warm and fuzzy and I stay up in the empathy part of really mirroring for them and really being that therapeutic aligned facilitator with them, and it's all about, it's your change, you can decide to do this or not, I'm in a dangerous zone up there, risk of collusion with them. Risk of collusion of, it's not your fault, you were abused as a child, and you can't help it, So I'm in a real danger zone here of collusion, and that's a trap door, right? But I also know if I am too far down in this other opposing quadrant down here was all accountability and power and control, and I'm getting in their face and making them be responsible for their change, right? Now I risk igniting all of this resistance, right? So, oh my goodness, in the midst of all of this dynamic intersection, it's my job to invite our clients to change, right? So empathy is embedded all throughout this, and empathy became literally my key. It became, got a fly in here, sorry, gnat in here. It became my vehicle. It became how I was able to connect, get past the resistance, and particularly as a female facilitator, get past all of that to be able to reach them, but it was also what I was trying to ignite in them. And it was a ton of fun, you guys. It was just a ton of fun, and I regret that I don't do it anymore. Did y'all hear that I'm going to retire in a year, and I get to go back now for my 4th act, and this could be very well much in my future as my 4th act. That's all I got, unless you want to talk some more.
At this point, we encourage you to post questions or comments in the chat, or if you just want to raise your hand and ask something at this point, feel free to do that as well. Yep, go right ahead, Dr. Jordan. Oh, you're still muted.
Am I unmuted? Okay. What I always love about your talks is the way that lived life permeates every level that you talk about. So I appreciate your living in and understanding theory of rhetoric, theory of interaction, and then theory of the individual. What I want to ask you is this: what I try to do is draw threads between many of the talks that have occurred. And when I listen to the incredible amount of depth you yourself had to go into to manage this multi-scale phenomenon every time you were with them, let alone having to manage the person who's supposed to be helping you do the work. If we try to take the model that you've described and we try to activate that somehow culturally in terms of our current political cultural situation with so much racial hate in the environment, racial issues, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just, do you think it's possible to bring this type of thing you've talked about to that larger scale issue? And if so, how do you think it might happen? Could you start again, Diane? You're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. Yeah, that is a dynamic question, Scott, and it is so much the essence of where we are at right now as a society, right? And as I talked about those delicate tensions and the landmines all around us, you can extrapolate that right to where we're at right now in our social world, and particularly when we're talking about racial reckoning and how do we go forward as a society, you know? And on one hand, okay, who of us have not had that conversation at the Thanksgiving table with that uncle, right? Or that cousin, or for me, that brother, right? And you just want to go, I just got done talking about violence and I almost said you want to go for the throat, right? But it's hard to have those conversations, but yet I know when I want to have that conversation with my brother or my uncle, we're not going to get anywhere unless we can come to a meeting of the minds. And so if I automatically start out with highly directive, highly confrontive, highly in your face position, we're going to polarize, right? So in a way you can extrapolate that to this. Now that is not without saying these are painful experiences. And it's hard for, okay, I'm a white woman. I've not experienced racism. I have experienced homophobia. And so if I'm a victim to that, if I've experienced that, it's really hard for me to meet that person and say, I'd like to talk with you about this because it's so triggering for me. But I know if I'm triggered, I'm probably not going to get anywhere with moving that other person, right? So it's difficult and it's fraught with landmines, but I think unless we can come to a place of empathy, and I'll tell you, what I've enjoyed is I've lived a lifetime and I've enjoyed watching homophobia decrease and social acceptance of queerness just increase to the point that it's really not as prevalent, right? How did that happen in our society? And the way that happened in my life, the way that happened is personal connection. that happen from people knowing me and saying, but wait a minute, I don't like queers, but I know you and I like you. I'm going to have to reassess this. So until we come together in that personal coming together and sharing our intimate, close stories of who we seeing each other, we can't get there, right? But it's so hard.
There's a question right there in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it so that those who are joining outside of Zoom can hear as well. This is from Leanne, who says, Diane, thank you for your passion and commitment to helping everyone involved in IPV. You mentioned that victim was intentionally used in interactions with the perpetrators. When their childhood abuse was uncovered in these groups, was victim used again in their storytelling and your facilitation, or was another word used as a boundary between the perpetrator and their victim or victims?
Yeah, that's really a very astute question, Leanne. Let me also give a little bit of context about, we intentionally use the word victim, and I mention it so that we can avoid collusion and the rationalization, and it's also to, well, it's to help them move along the line of accountability. We make them use the word victim as well, and it's to help them along the line of accountability. We do, it's only a 26-week long group. It's not psychotherapy, it's psychoeducational. So we don't go very deep into their childhoods, but we use a lot of medium, because to just drill in and have them talk is hard. So we use a lot of vehicle, a lot of medium for that. We use a lot of video role plays. We use a lot of vignettes that they watch. We use a lot of film. We use music. And then we can talk about it through this vehicle that gives a little bit of distance between, you know, them and their victim in their real life, right? So we have this one really good video that we use, and it's called Something My Father Would Do. And it's 4 men who have been in recovery as perpetrators themselves for a good long time. And they talk about their journey, about what their father would do to them, and then how they became that person, right? And so when we do these sessions on looking back at their childhood and their earliest templates of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, we will use the word victim, and that isn't with them, and it's intentional. And part of the reason for that is hard for them to go there and look at that. So we want to try to neutralize as much as possible the taking on the shame of it. And we're not condoning and we're not excusing, but if they can step into the fact that I come into this adulthood and I can understand it now, I understand it. So I can begin to take some responsibility for it. I'll tell you the other thing that we use in group, and it has to be really critically timed. We have to be we're about 13 or 14 weeks into this 26 weeks, because we have to be able to have built up some rapport and a sense of trust and safety in this room before we can go there. But if some of you heard the Lisa 911 audio tape, I'm looking around if I'm getting any head shakes. It's brutal. It's raw. You can Google it and find it on the Google machine, Lisa 911. And it's an actual audio tape from a police dispatcher in San Diego, about a little girl who's about 6 years old, Lisa, and she's calling the police to come to her house because her stepdaddy is beating up her mother. And you can palpate the terror. I mean, it's those of you who are teaching psychology, look it up. It's a visceral experience, right? But boy, we intentionally use it about halfway through the group, because it is the tipping point. It has to be managed well, because it can be really shame evocative, but it's a tipping point, because some of the guys who are coming along in group, and if they're kind of a resistor and they're not taking up what we're putting down about the empathy for their partner, and they're still into the rationalization, a way we can get into them is their children. They love their children, their fathers, they're invested in being good fathers. And if we can say, okay, well, maybe you're not ready to talk about what you do with your partner yet, but let's talk about your children and what this experience is like for them. And then the resistors that we have at that point, they become customers. Majority, if they have stuck along that far, they become customers, because they don't want to recapitulate this onto their children. That really wasn't the question you asked, Leanne, but that's where I went with this. So yeah, we use the word victim with really strategic intention. I think Risha might have a hand up, Nate.
Yep, go right ahead, Risha. I think you're still muted. No, we still
No.
can't hear you at the moment.
Do you have a headset in or something, Risha, that's hijacking?
How's that?
There
Yes.
you go.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I said thank you, Dean Zosky, for that really excellent talk. It made me think quite a bit about teaching, in particular because there are, I think, a lot of moments in the classroom, especially in large classrooms, where we hear something from the students, and my impulse, at least, is to be very directive and confrontational, or directive and confrontive, I think was your phrase, in order to create no ambiguity about how I feel about a particular topic and what I think is appropriate discourse for the classroom.
Yeah.
And also on behalf of, people who might feel very personally slighted by, what this student happens to be saying.
Yeah, right.
So it's a situation where, it's not exactly perpetrators and victims, but, those types of folks are in the same space together. So I was just wondering, how would you suggest that an educator manage, on the one hand, not wanting to shame and, tamp out any opportunity for, for guilt and then empathy and then growth and change. Because it seems to me, I think you're probably right that when I do that, I'm just creating shame, and it's sort of sending out a good performative message to the classroom. It's maybe good for the victims, good for me and my sense of myself, but it's probably not really good for their, those students, they're often very, they're not full-fledged homophobes or racists, but they have, some kind of cockamamie ideas that they're trying out. So
yeah, exactly.
There is, I think, an opportunity for those, for me and all of us to really educate those students, but I feel like I'm missing that opportunity when I clamp down. So I wanted to just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Risha. I do think teaching is very much a parallel to this. And I do agree. I often say that shame is rarely, if ever, conducive to a learning experience, right? And so, Risha, as you talk about that, it's not just that if your methods are too confrontive and sort of shame evocative for the sayer in the class, even if it's, I think, did you use the term cockamamie? I think you used that term, right? That's a clinical term, right? So even if it's a cockamamie idea or statement, right? The other thing, and how we respond, we've got a group milieu here. And so you're also, people, we're being watched, right? And so how we respond to that person is going to be a message for how we might respond to other people. So it's not just shutting that person down. It can also have a dampening effect to the entire, class sense of safety in a sense, right? So, hey, I'm going to tout a colleague of yours, Chris Jesfield. He's a professor in the School of Social Work, and he does a lot of reading and discussion, and he's beginning to do some writing on teaching as relational. He's a clinician, just every bit as much as I am, and he balances this parallel process beautifully in terms of teaching is relational. And we're teaching adults, right? Their education is self-determined. They don't have to be here, right? So if you think about it, it's not for us to require something of them. They're a free, self-determined customer here, right? Now, Risha, I want to build on your example a little bit, but what is our responsibility if that cockamamie thing they say in the classroom, let's give them a benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's based on their ignorance. Maybe it's based on their lack of exposure. Maybe they just don't know, right? Or maybe it's based in hate and they have an intention with it, right? Okay. So how we finesse that. Do some of you remember a couple of years ago when we were doing the Courageous Conversations discussions? I don't know if you remember that or not. So it was all about how to engage these conversations. So even if it's the person who is doing it intentionally to be incendiary and inflammatory in the classroom, how you handle it, you can handle it with strength, and you can handle it in terms of we won't use that word in this classroom and then pivot to another direction, or that word is maybe troubling for some people to hear. Can we talk about that? You know, there might be people in our students in our classrooms that they really are truly ignorant. They don't know that that's a word that is provocative, you know, and hurtful, right? And if you think that's what it is, there's a great opportunity there to have a learning experience for everybody. And if that young student who's legitimately ignorant is going to learn, he's got to be able to be invited into it and not feel embarrassed and shamed about it. So, Risha, you're right on target. What we're doing is relational work in the classroom. It is.
And I know Drs. Craig and Dr. Rocco have a question as well, so go right ahead.
The dynamic duo.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, well, Dean Zosky, excellent talk. And the question we were thinking about as we were hearing your analysis and really the kind of experience that you brought to your talk was, you know, as sort of a representative of the arm of the criminal justice system and the need for building empathy, I think one of the things that came to mind for us with regard to like the question of race is, you know, what do we do, or maybe you can reflect on, or maybe you've had some direct observation with regard to like this kind of microdynamics that you're describing here. You know, Dr. Jordan asked a question about kind of the macro elements of race and empathy with regard to what you're experiencing, what you've described. And I guess, what would you say, like with regard to like the Lisa 911 talk or video, right? I mean, what are your observations, or what do you think is the role of empathy when we're adding this kind of complexity of race to this for communities that are intimidated of or are mistrustful of the criminal justice system? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. And Byron, were you wanting to add on to that?
Well, and as he was asking that question, I actually was thinking about something as you were speaking, within the queer community as well, right? And I was kind of talking about this afternoon in the meeting we had in our department in the School of Comm, of knowing violence in queer couples, right? And specifically, I'm talking about Black queer couples, right? Where it's actually the violence has actually led to death, right? And I can recall at that moment, there was a fear of the partner of calling the police, even at that time, right? And that was so I think that, you know, and then we compound that with transgender folks as well, right? Who have had some run-ins, you know, and aren't really comfortable with the legal system as well, with law enforcement.
Yeah. Let me start with the place that I go to first here. When we talk about, you know, where does empathy fit into this? And the example you give, may I call you Steve? Is that okay? And I wish you would call me Diane. Steve, okay. You might have asked it directionally in terms of community people understanding police. I think there's a whole lot of work we need to do in this direction of certainly the criminal justice system, law enforcement system, and the community having an empathic gaze towards communities of color, queer folk, transgender folk, and making that connection a person to person so that we don't do the objectification, right? So we don't do the, what I see is a color or a gender or a sexual orientation or gender identity, and I'm going to move into a stereotype from that, and I no longer see the person. So I think there's a whole lot of work that has to be done with our law enforcement and criminal justice system to do sort of this work I talk about with perpetrators, about being able to make an empathic connection and see the person there, not the exterior or stereotype, right? We know that in law enforcement, there's a high there's a high degree of domestic violence in families where there's a law enforcement person in the family. I think we see as people, I'm making a broad brush here, you know, but I think the system is so polarizing that law enforcement officers begin to just fall victim to or fall into the objectification and no longer seeing the person there. You know, we hear a lot about defund the police, right? And you might have a reaction to that. I don't know how you defund the police. I don't, know. I would say, whatever you want to call it, I would say that I see a light forward in terms of bringing in help for law enforcement who are responding to scenes of personal struggle, domestic violence or a suicide attempt or gestation, So I do see that we need an additive approach to this, not rely on people that really are not trained for this. Back in the day, when I was a beginning bachelor level social worker, I worked in Peoria. And we had this in Peoria. We had the emergency response system. They went out, there were social workers, the MSW social workers that went out in tandem with officers if there was a domestic violence call or a suicide attempt or anything like that. But the funding was lost. We need to get back to those days. I'm not sure that's what you asked, Steve, but that's where I went.
No, that's excellent. Actually, no, Dan, I think in cultural studies, rhetorical studies, literary studies, sociological studies. There's psychological studies, I imagine too. Although I can't really speak to the literature, but there's been the concept of the gaze is critical. Yes. and we often talk about the gaze in a kind of as a kind of micro political or kind of power dynamic, right? Mm-hmm.
And an objectification.
Absolutely. But I think that you used a phrase, the empathetic gaze, mm-hmm. and I think that's a really interesting turn, right? Because I think we'd often, at least in the theoretical literature that we're familiar with, we're used to talking about the gaze as sort of this kind of power dynamic, and I think that in a negative sense. Yeah. Right, power in a negative sense. But I'm wondering, like, what does it mean to kind of teach an empathetic gaze, or in the classroom, like a lot of right. People have been pointing out, right? How do you build that in the classroom? But then also, within like these kind of larger structures, like what does that look like? Because again, like something that we talked about in our talk last spring was, we have a tendency to militarize social problems. Yeah. And I think
we're the West.
Of course, yeah. And if you look at the history of our public culture, our public narratives around policing, criminality, it's always framed as a war on something, right? The war on crime or the war on drugs. And I think for as rhetorical scholars, I think that the question is like, what metaphor do we use? We're so accustomed to, using a frame of war for understanding complex problems, but it really shows you where I think what you're describing really shows where this leads. Yeah. And it leads to this dehumanization. It leads to this dead end where we really, as a culture, have to articulate a new vision. We need a new metaphor. We need some kind of a new way of dramatizing, or a new narrative that can allow us to imagine a more empathetic way of relating. And I think you kind of put on the table, like, how do we create an empathetic gaze? I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, so think about it. Imagine if this became the frame for how we encountered our social experience, life, our definition of society experiences, and it was really truly an empathic gaze. Where does that take us versus a power over, dehumanizing and objectification? And as you say, Steve, our language, our words become our reality. And it becomes the frame of where we even start, right? So could we imagine if that was this world, how different this would be? I have a lot of hope in this young generation coming up, and they're in our midst, they're in our hands. Each of you should never underestimate the influence you can have in a classroom to be that pebble that starts that ripple.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Diane, can I ask you another question? Nate, do we have time? I didn't mean to interject.
Absolutely. Dive in.
Okay. All right. So, Diane, I hope you're in this for 4 hours, because I'm like ready to go, right? Like, I'm just in love with this conversation. I'm thrilled with it.
I could talk about this for a long time.
And I thank you so much for sharing this with us. What just occurred to me is you were talking about, right, the training that needs to happen in law enforcement. And so I was aware, right, that there is this higher rate of domestic violence that occurs in law enforcement. So here I am thinking, is there training already set up that speaks to law enforcement who potentially have this childhood trauma and or domestic violence in their current situation that addresses whatever kind of block that they might have, and thus an inability to see domestic violence happen within a home?
I frankly don't know of any training set up like that, Leanne. I don't know of it. My fear is that that system is so self-protective that we know that officers often will protect other officers. If there's a charge of domestic violence and you're an officer, it's career killing because you can't carry a firearm. You have to give up your firearm. So there's a great deal of protection within that system. Wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if in police academies, in training to become a law enforcement officer, there was quite a bit of work done at the front end to just explore, why are you attracted to this profession? And to explore, earlier models and why do you want to, of all the things you could do, why do you want to do this? I'm going to call out a colleague of ours in this university, Jeff Klepek. Jeff is a lieutenant at the ISU PD. He's retired from Bloomington PD. And I know Jeff quite well. And I know his wife quite well. She was a colleague of mine in MSW, and I know Jeff very well. Jeff was an example of an officer. He sees his role as a servant. He sees his role as in service to the communities he's working with. Why can't we have more Jeffs, right? So I guess I just wonder if the training for law enforcement, if it started with really an intense internal examination about, why do you want to get into this? What's your motivation? And then along the way, a lot of professional development to help take off those hard edges. I'm not here to beat up on cops, right? When you think about every day they go out in their job, their life could be on the line, right? I can't think of a more dangerous occupation, So how does one become desensitized and anesthetized to that so that you can do your job? Well, you're going to become hardened, right? And you fall into the victimization or the objectification, the dehumanizing. And from having had a close relationship with a former police officer, I know that system often reinforces that. It becomes a really self-reinforcing system. So I'm not painting them necessarily as the evil monsters. It's sort of, we set up the system to take them down that, it's easy to go down that path, I guess. Why can't we have more Jeffs? If y'all see Officer Jeff out there, tell him he was a topic of our conversation.
Diane, if I could just follow up on your recent comments. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of what are we doing for persons in law enforcement, and I would even argue people in the military, who are put in life-threatening situations and asked to be stoic.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's actually when you end up in these moments of fight or flight, when you are in micro danger at that moment, that once you've gone into the fight mode, empathy is not what's going to happen.
Right, exactly. Survival.
And so when people collapse into that state circumstantially, what are we doing for them afterwards, right? To decompress that state. We either have to believe that we can create things so that people will never be in that state, right? That they're, or if we have to figure out a way to train them to not have to be stoic, right? To be in the moment that we've placed them in, and then I would argue responsibly engage the trauma or whatever that they may have experienced. Otherwise, if we ask them to be stoic, it festers. Then it becomes increasingly difficult to have an empathetic eye.
Yeah. And we can't really repress that trauma. It is going to come out in some way. It will come out, right? And, you know, Scott, as you talk about the fight or flight, and I want to emphasize the examples that you use, law enforcement or the military, we're talking about repeated, sustained experiences of the fight or flight response, the literal physiological response of fight or flight. And this is true as well of perpetrators who come up during those developmental periods of witnessing abuse in their home or being a victim of child abuse. There's a physiological response of the fight or flight response for a survival mechanism, right? And if that occurs during critical developmental periods, it's almost like becomes that gets recalibrated as now it goes from being a state to a trait. Okay, we all have the fight or flight physiological response as a state experience when we need to have it, when you know, we almost hit that car, or, you know, somebody scares us, right? And we have that visceral response, but then we come back down to an equilibrium. But if you're repeatedly exposed and your surviving depends on it, it kind of shifts for you. It becomes your new normal. You're recalibrated. That's your trait now. Okay. So, you know, Scott used the word stoic. Okay. And if I'm in this constant state of hypervigilance of the fight or flight response, it's all about survivability. And I have to be stoic. I can't go into looking at these emotions. There's no safety to do that. I have to simply focus on survivability. So some of these systems we ask people to work in can be, you know, fairly inhumane. And then it's perhaps necessary, but then when they come back from it, what do we do to help them recalibrate to a more of a lower level of arousal? You know, it's a responsibility we've neglected.
Thanks.
All right, there is a question from earlier from Joe Blaney, who asks, tell us more about the fourth act.
The fourth or the fifth or the sixth. So the fourth act, Joe, I want to go back to being a social worker. I've gone to the dark side of administration. It's been tremendously rewarding. I say about spending one more year, I say there are not more beautiful people I would rather spend one more year with than all of you. But I want to go back to my roots. I'm a social worker. That's the fourth act, Joe.
Good to hear.
Nate and Scott, and Steve and Byron, are you going to let class out 7 minutes early?
I think Byron has something he wants to.
You want to say something, Byron? I can.
Oh, no, Scott, I was just saying you were muted. So if we're ready, if there are no more questions, we're ready to end. Scott, can you put up the flyer? And thank you so much, Dean Zosky, for your talk. I think we all really appreciate it and learned a lot, and thanks for entertaining all our questions. So
yeah, thank you all, and please have a good evening.
Thank you. So next week, everyone, on May 4th, we have our next talk, and that's with Dr. Teresa Rojas, from the Professor of English and Professor of Ethnic Studies from the Modesto Junior College. And her talk is Narrative as Empathy Training. And then following that, we will have our final talk of the year. And oh, look at there. It's Doctors Byron B. Craig and Dr. Stephen E. Rocco from Indiana University, and I'm at Illinois State University. We'll be on June 1st at 7 p.m. And our talk is, what should empathy be in this moment, historical reckoning, which reconciling Black trauma and witness. That's probably going to change. That title might change a little bit, but whatever it changes to, it's going to be a fantastic talk. And I'm not patting myself on the back here, no shameless plug, but it will be a good talk. It has to be following these last two talks. So we have to bring it now. Since Diane brought it tonight, now we have to bring it. So, again, if there's no other questions, we will dismiss class and let you out 5 minutes early now. So again, thank you, Diane, for your talk this evening. We'll see you all. Hopefully you can show up next week, everyone. All right.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Take care.